Thank you for joining us today for this roundtable on a topic that would hit close to home for a lot of us. It's not easy being a woman online. There are barriers to entry from the very start. Women are less likely to own a phone, and if they do have one, they may not have full control over the device without the interference of a father or a husband. Within online spaces, women are disproportionately subject to unwelcome advances, harassment, and outright threats of violence, as well as more subtle, insidious forms of sexism. For example, during the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic in India, women who asked for help for their loved ones reported getting unwelcome and inappropriate messages and calls. Women from underserved communities may also struggle to find content in their own language that speaks to their experiences. Part of this is attributable to the lack of meaningful diversity amongst decision makers and coders in many of these platforms. Tech giants may commit to fostering an open and inclusive environment, but big tech's approach to diversity is often limited to silos as opposed to consistent efforts to diversify across their operations. Yet, the catch-22 is that online spaces are also liberating. They help create a sense of community and amplify rallying calls around common causes, the Me Too movement being a primary example. Social media also empowers. Women entrepreneurs and small businesses are able to reach a wider audience through online engagement. We've also seen the rise of brilliant women content creators on Instagram, YouTube, or Josh. It's within this milieu that my colleagues Mitali Mukherjee, Aditi Ratho, and Shruti Jain wrote this incisive report, brilliantly titled Unsocial Media, Inclusion, Representation, and Safety for Women in Social Networking Platforms. We're also joined by Sinha, Executive Director of the Center for Internet and Society, who wrote another great policy brief on regulating online harassment. With that, I'll turn to Mitali to briefly introduce the paper and why they wrote it.
Trisha, thank you so much for that. Before I start talking about the paper, maybe I'll do a quick round of thank yous to everyone gathered around the table and those not here. First up, Amber, thank you so much for taking time out and joining us in this discussion. We were very keen on having some male perspective in this chat, and we're really glad that you're here to provide that as, of course, the context of the conversation we're having. Big thanks to both my co-writers, Aditi and Shruti. Shout out to Shruti, who's the one who coined this name for us when we were struggling to figure out what we should be calling the paper. And of course, from the ORF community, thank you to Samir for really leading the way, to Vinaya for helping us through the editing process, and to Trisha today for moderating the discussion and setting the context so well. Before I talk about the paper, Trisha, I just, it's almost timely that we're having this conversation now. A few days back, and this happened as recently as yesterday, the Delhi police has registered a complaint against a group of individuals that were running a site online called Sulli Deals. Basically, they were targeting women from a minority community, many of them journalists as well, putting up their photographs and auctioning these women. This was being routed via another platform. Two things happened, as you said. One, the fact that this occurred online, that it was blatant harassment, it was extremely upsetting for the women who experienced that. But the other thing that happened was that the voices that rose in protest and in support of these women were all online. It was a whole lot of journalists and others who came out, completely calling this out of line. It was the Editors Guild that registered a complaint online as well. And, following all that, the Delhi police actually registered a complaint. So like you said, we do have a very sharp double-edged sword over here. It just swings both ways. In terms of the context of the paper, I think the three of us sat down to talk about gender. That was our main focus, and we really wanted to do content about that. But I think it flew quite organically when we started talking about what it is that we really wanted to address first. I think COVID has shifted so much of our lives into this virtual space in terms of how we interact, how we work, how we meet friends, how we socialize. And layered under that, of course, is everything that you pointed to, which is the blatant harassment that women face often women in positions of power or influence more so than the others. But I think I can safely say, just like you would be in a room full of women and you would ask them to raise their hands and ask if anyone had ever been harassed, you would have a room full of raised hands. Similarly, I think you'd have a room full of raised virtual hands over here. So that's one part of it. The other thing I think we were really conscious of, though, is that we didn't want to talk about a problem that existed and everyone was aware of without talking about where the loopholes were and without talking about what the possible solutions were. We were quite mindful of that. We were going to spend a lot of time sort of dredging into the past and figuring out how we got here, but we also wanted to talk about, what are the gaps that exist? How can we fix it? Is this fixable? What can be done by which party? So I think that's really a very broad contour of the paper, and I want to get all the other voices in. So I'm going to wind up here. I'm sure there'll be lots more to discuss about this.
Thank you, Mitali, for that incisive overview of your paper. I'll now turn to Shruti. Mitali mentioned that, of course, social media is a double-edged sword. What are some of the positive experiences or positives of being on social media for women?
First of all, Mitali, thank you so much. I think that summed up the paper wonderfully. Answering your question, Trisha, I think first, most important thing is that digital tools and especially social media has democratized information. And it has become an important medium to engage in socio, political, and economic issues. So, especially in our occasional paper, we have looked at these three broad functionalities, that is social, economic, and political. So, when we talk about social media has not just helped women build social capital, but also nurture interpersonal relationships by overcoming time and barriers of time and space. And it has also one of the things that makes social media so important is that it helps women transcend borders and build transnational networks. Additionally, I think there was a Twitter survey which studied about 5 lakh tweets across 10 cities in India, and they came up with some really interesting insights. I think they came up with with a statistic that said almost most of the women gather on social media to discuss points of individual passion points such as entertainment, books, followed by current affairs, also finding psychosocial support through communities, engaging in social issues. I think this is while we can, while it takes a backseat sometimes. Gaining psychosocial support is very important. Especially we see that especially during COVID, when we see domestic violence kind of increasing. Psychosocial support becomes extremely important for women, and women find this support through their communities on social media. Another aspect where women use social media is social commerce, what is called S-commerce now. I think borrowing from the term e-commerce. Social media, it kind of provides women-owned businesses more opportunities to increase their growth and access financial services. It also helps them build new skills that can benefit their businesses. And especially during the time of COVID, I think it helps their businesses come online. It kind of supports their need to conduct business. This basically overcomes the need to have a physical space or invest in a physical space. So I think that way social media plays a very important role. And this is actually very visible in conflict zone areas. So for example, the Kashmir Chamber of Commerce and Industry came up with a statistic where they said almost 4,000 women-led online businesses are present in Kashmir Valley, and most women carry out their business through these social media sites like Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp. So these are become very important for women where they have, limited mobility. Also, I think Facebook was according to Women's World Banking report, Facebook was the most used social media platform to communicate with customers and vendors. So it makes it much easier for women to communicate with their vendors. It helps them grow their businesses, grow their networks. So we covered social and we covered economic. The third most important thing is, I think, political participation. While I think someone mentioned that social media is a double-edged sword, it can uh, it can have a lot of positives, but it can also we'll discuss this further. It can have many negatives, but the positives that come out of this is that women have started sharing their experiences. A lot of the issues that were considered taboo earlier have come up on social media. For example, Me Too movement had gained a lot of popularity in the US, but in India, around 2017, the movement gained popularity, and women started coming out with their experiences. Women also started sharing their photographs and stories about reclaiming public spaces. And I think this issue was very dealt with a very important paper called Why Loiter, where they basically where they basically discuss why women do not need a reason to loiter, and they can just reclaim their public spaces as men do all the time. Um, and it also kind of provides a forum to kind of discuss their online harassment and domestic abuse. Like I mentioned, in COVID-19, I think it has become a very important platform to kind of gain community support. But keeping this in mind, I think we also realize that this is basically just limited to urban area where women have very few women have meaningful access to social media and internet. So while the discourse around sexual harassment and online activism has increased and has grown, but it largely remains limited to certain areas in India, especially to urban areas.
Thanks, Shruti. A very interesting point about the gendered aspect of loitering in public spaces. And I just want on the point on gains from social media in terms of social empowerment for women. So, for example, there's a famous study which found that the advent of cable TV in rural India correlated with lower tolerance for domestic violence, better treatment of daughters, and greater desire for autonomy amongst women. Have we seen similar gains on social media, or is social media just a continuation of offline trends? And if we could also link this perhaps to, in the pandemic, there was a rise in gender-based violence, both online and offline. Aditi, if you could address this question.
Hi, everyone. Firstly, really glad to be part of this discussion, talking about an issue which Trisha rightly said really hits home. Since Mitali and Shruti both spoke about the need for this paper and the place of women in it and touched upon the positives of social media, women's representation and inclusion in social media is definitely affected by bullying and trolling, which, let's be honest, is a unique, consistent, and exponential form of harassment when it comes to just women. And Trisha, to answer your question, while there was an increase in reporting of cybercrime during the lockdown, statistically, according to data from the National Commission for Women, in the month of April 2020, 54 cybercrime complaints were received online, as opposed to 37 in April 2019. So that was quite a jump in a year. But I would like to mention that these numbers would be more if there was more awareness about the platforms that can be used to report such crime and seek the redressal that's required. And they exist. And it's quite tech savvy. Cybercrime in India is defined as any unlawful act where a computer or a communication device or a computer network is used to commit or facilitate the commission of crime. And this includes cyberbullying, cyberstalking on any communication device, and includes cybercrime on social media platforms. And there are sections of the IT Act and IPC which support victims of such bullying and where perpetrators can be booked for an offense. And And the way someone can be booked is by first reporting it on the National Crimes Records Bureau, which has a very comprehensive cybercrime reporting portal, which caters to complaints pertaining to cybercrimes with a focus on crimes committed against women and children. And the website also provides a national helpline and the facility to track the complaints and reports. So it's quite comprehensive. But how many people actually know about this besides the very hyper-aware section of society that is watching this webinar right now? The government has actually pumped in a lot of funds to create an awareness generation unit, which is a welcome step. The unit is mandated to disseminate cybercrime do's and don'ts, spread awareness about cyber hygiene, cybercrime in early stages of education as a component of the school curriculum itself. And through this medium, it's hoped that individuals will be informed about the various types of cybercrime and information and how to securely use technology. But I feel and what we know so far is the exact plan and rollout and uptake by various states remains unknown. So we really need to generate data to gauge the barriers to awareness generation and receptiveness. And these units should also immediately initiate drives to impart knowledge on the portals and helplines that can be used to make these complaints. A massive number of 63% of internet users don't know where to lodge these complaints on cybercrime. And when these are lodged, or someone goes to the police station to file an FIR, a lot of the times implementation and follow through is lacking, because incidents have been reported where law enforcement officials say that just remove yourself on social media, or block your profile, or block this person, and there's no follow through of actually using this as a tangible offense and a tangible crime, because a lot of the time law enforcement officials are more likely to take action on physical threats and traditional criminal law. So we need to amp up capacity building measures and sensitization drives as well, which do exist, but we need more data on how much of it has led to actual tangible focused enforcement of these acts and policies that we have. Because unless women and girls are assured that their complaints will be taken seriously, even the steps to create awareness generation of existing redressal mechanisms will be quite redundant. So I'll stop there on the ways in which we can generate awareness of how to at least report these incidences so we can get the redressal we seek.
Trisha, I just want to come in really quickly, if I may, before we hear from Amber, just to sort of buttress the point that Aditi is making. So, two things are happening here, which I think happen in the physical domain as well. One is that large organizations are squarely placing the onus of acting on a woman. If you read through the nature of what you're supposed to do when you face this kind of harassment, it is, did you report it? Did you block him? This is the same thing as saying, don't take the same route home every night. If you're alone on the bus, get off if you're the only woman, This is the same, it's the exact same thing, just playing out in a different domain. You're saying, you've been harassed and you felt attacked. Well, what are you going to do about it? So I think, here's sort of really the big question that I think large platforms need to address and attack. What is the filter or measure you are putting in place? Apologies for my dog. Give me 1 second to let him out. Just 1 second. I am so sorry, guys. Let me just pick up from there. So the point I was making is, what are large organizations doing to take responsibility for what's happening online? That's one point. And the second point, as Aditi said, there are mechanisms to file complaints, but if memory serves me correctly, when I looked up the data in terms of how many cases had been registered in, I think this was a 2018-2019 number, it was less than 300. Now, even anecdotal evidence will tell you that on a daily basis, women are facing harassment in many, many multiples of that. So, what's happening at the end and at the start to prevent women from going down that route of saying, you know what, I'm going to register a case. That's just the two quick points I wanted to make about this whole, the mechanism that exists.
Thanks, Mitali. And thanks for pointing out what we could call like a deal with it attitude that often comes with these kinds of issues. And there were several points there about reporting mechanisms and data that I will pick up at a later stage as well. But first, going off of something Aditi said, and which Amber, you have also said, that harassment is a form of censorship. Could you elaborate on that? And then any additional comments you have on the paper as well.
Thanks, Trisha, and thanks very much to Ada for inviting me for this discussion. First of all, let me congratulate the authors on an excellent paper which captures the state of, I think, both online harassment and other sexist abuse that women, particularly in India, face. I think there is a lot of literature that exists globally in the last few years on the subject, but it's good to see more and more of it coming from India as well. So my congratulations to all the authors on that. I think going back to your kind of immediate question, Trisha, the point of view that I tried to argue, and I kind of would like to take it up from the earlier discussion here as well, that when most of abuse that is targeted at women and other marginalized communities online is fairly systemic. So to begin with, we thought of the internet as as a medium, particularly for those communities which face a lot of systemic challenges in the offline world, to overcome them in the online world. But obviously, problems of the offline world have largely been carried onto the web as well. And the reason I use the idea of censorship there is the way censorship works is quite different online. So earlier, when you had certain publishing houses, publishers essentially as controllers of censorship. So you had larger bodies, the state or the publishing houses, which would control the voices which were allowed to sort of disseminate more information. And so censorship was much more centralized. But now censorship also exists in the form of organized campaigns. The cost of the sort of psychological cost, and in some cases also the sort of real world physical costs of being able to express oneself online can become so severe in the form of harassment, in the form of constant abuse, and in the form of hate speech, that it pushes women and other marginalized communities away from those platforms. And I think my hypothesis is based on anecdotal evidence purely, is that over the last decade, if you see how activists within marginalized communities have moved from platform to platform, before it becomes, once a platform becomes extremely mainstream, it gets a certain amount of attention. There is a certain amount of increase in trolling, and then there are newer platforms that these communities have to move to, in a sense, to be able to continue to express themselves. So it does exist very much in a kind of censorious form, and that is the problem, that most of the regulatory measures that we see are focused on individual instances of sexist hate speech or online harassment. And then obviously there is the sort of legal conundrum that we find ourselves in, that hate speech is often hard to define. There is a fairly high standard that it has, and often a lot of online harassment or sexist speech may not meet that standard. So in that vacuum, we saw community guidelines emerging as as different governance mechanisms. But largely, despite the uniformity of community guidelines across jurisdictions, if we actually look at its implementation, it depends a lot on the regulatory setup within that state. So if we look at, for instance, data transparency reporting by, let's say, a platform like Facebook or Twitter, the impact of, let's say, regulations such as the NetzDG regulation in Germany or the online harms paper in the UK is very clearly evident in how speedily takedown measures are taken in those countries as opposed to others. So I think there is one entire gamut where there is need for more regulatory oversight of platforms and looking at these forms of co-regulation, where there is a greater duty of care on platforms to protect, rather than shifting the onus on individuals to actually take the responsibility of flagging instances and then following up. So there's a lot to be desired in terms of transparency protocols, a lot of responses to take down requests still functions within a black box, and it's very hard to understand how these decisions are taken, even though they are supposedly taken based on internationally recognized human rights principles. But I think the bigger challenge, and this is going to be, I think, a big issue over the next decade, is how to address this problem as what it is. It is a systemic problem. It will not get resolved by focusing governance measures only on individual instances, because often they are systemic, they are organized, they don't require, and it's very easy to organize sort of these kind of hate campaigns online now, and women more than anyone else are the recipients of it.
Thank you for some very interesting sets of points there, Amber, especially the fact that, the way the responses of socials are tailored, it's often like individual focused, whereas social media enables a lot more like collective censorship through mass reporting, for example, or through like organized harassment campaigns conducted through like coordinated WhatsApp groups, for example. A related question is that a less explored aspect of women on social media is that women often self-police. Say, for example, women hesitate to put their own pictures on their profile on social media, or they might hide their gender, or they might restrict the kinds of things they say on social media for fear of reprisals. With problems like this that are hard to quantify, are there policy measures, both social media policy as well as government policy, that can help? Aditi, if you want to answer that first, and then we can have everyone pitch in their thoughts as well.
Sure. Absolutely. Women do self-police themselves because, as I said before, if women felt not just safer in the community, but also safe enough that if they reported an incident, it would be taken seriously, then the self-policing would reduce and women would feel freer in these communities. A lot of women feel freer in, and Mitali spoke about this in the paper, in women-only communities where they can engage in a freer way, feel safer, talk about things that they feel uncomfortable talking about in other social media platforms. And though social media platforms have, as Amber said, they have attempted to make these policies where if you act and violate their community guidelines or hateful conduct policy or abusive policy, action will be taken against you. It is a lot of steps. The first step is something like, okay, flag the person or block the person. If that is not enough and the crime is larger than just a mere blocking the person, then an internal committee oversees a report and takes action depending on what constitutes what that action comes under, violating which policy. And the punishment varies from complete suspension to temporary suspension to just blocking, or this person can never contact you again. But there is no concrete definition of any of these acts. So there isn't any feeling of, if this person does this to me, I know this action will be taken. So instead of going through all these processes and waiting, and I mean, women would just prefer to not be part of this, or like not speak their mind in on a topic or issues that may lead to such aggressive behavior. For example, using aggressive slurs is one of the ways in which the abusive policy, hateful conduct policy could be violated. But what constitutes these aggressive slurs? Some examples of these. And these guidelines also say things like, we will not take action against every instances where insulting terms are used. This is really vague. I mean, there has to be room for some flexibility in terms of how insulting something can be. But I feel like if there are some examples that can be used, it can reduce the arbitrariness of not taking action and taking action. Maybe a dossier of types of behavior that are strictly a violation without any scope or loopholes to justify this kind of behavior, and remove this arbitrary nature of punishment and consequences. And we discussed this in the paper as well, that there needs to be a strict definition of gendered abuses as well, because that doesn't exist yet. So I feel like women don't feel like these platforms have a space where their concerns can be redressed. Therefore, they partake to self-policing as opposed to feeling comfortable enough to go to these authorities for it.
Thanks, Aditi. Mitali, Shruti, your thoughts?
Shruti, you want to go first?
Sure. So I want to pick up something what Amber earlier mentioned, that the problem is systemic, and this is where we need to realize that censorship can be in the form of exclusion, and exclusion is systemic. So when we talk about social media platforms, exclusion can happen in a very it can happen either directly by taking by taking action, actually censoring somebody's comments or pictures or voice. But it can also happen indirectly, because dominant groups and cultures and languages, they often play a very significant role in selecting who can be heard and who should be heard and seen online. So, when we looked at the Facebook audience insights data, which is available to everyone, I think, at least till March 6, 2021, it was. I hope it still is. The highest number of female Facebook users were from the top metro cities. For example, Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, Chennai, Kolkata, Hyderabad, and Pune. So this really reflects that women from rural India are hardly represented in social media. And even if we talk about cities, it's only the tier 1 cities that women are being represented in. Also, 43,000 villages in India still do not own mobile phone devices. So social media is, far behind when we talk about access to digital tools. Also, apart from this, when we talk about access to social media, it should be meaningful access. It should not just be owning a device. When we checked the Facebook Insights data, we found that 96% of the female users in India use Facebook through their mobile phones. Only 3% use it through their desktops, and a minuscule number of women use it from their other devices. So to put this in perspective, we need to understand that only 59% of women in India are currently mobile phone users. And of them, only 16% are mobile internet users. So the number of women who have access to social media is already very, very low. Another important aspect that I think Trisha had mentioned earlier was language. Language is something that we take for granted, but as we know, most of the mainstream online content and communication is anglicized. When we looked at the Facebook data, almost 91% of the total language by women in India was in English, US or UK. Only 6% was in Hindi and only 1% was in Bengali. So when there's a lack of content in their local languages, it really limits women's participation at the grassroots. Apart from that, digital literacy is also an issue with most women in rural India. There was also an interesting study by Lokhniti where they found that social media is also largely dominated by the upper castes in urban areas. So the study actually reflected that upper castes are twice as likely to have exposure to social media as compared to others. There are several such divides. It happens uh, in the within the country as well as transboundary discrimination. For example, advanced and emerging economies have different patterns. So an interesting research showed that while men make up most of the social media users in developing countries, it's actually the opposite in advanced countries. So I think this was something which is very interesting. And of course, other than that, especially in India, I think cultural mores play a very important role. While researching, we found anecdotes where women in India, especially rural India, were being denied smartphones, not because they couldn't afford it or because of the cost, but because a male family member thought that it would be indecent for women to use mobile devices or internet. So I think this is something which we can probably, which we should focus on.
Thanks,
And
Shruti.
yeah, and that's ironic, Trisha. Considering the fact that the largest sort of growth we are seeing on a month-on basis is in rural India. So something is going wrong. It is at the same time the fastest growing market, but at the same time excluding one entire chunk. I just wanted to say about this self-policing thing, Trisha, that none of this starts off that way. I mean, because part of what we did was go back into history. So if you go into the 2008 period, and all the way actually up to even 2013, engagement by women was higher. Interactivity with these platforms was higher. So it started off as something that women were drawn to, and they did want to share, and they did want to explore, and they were spending a lot of time on that platform. But you have to think about what happened along the way that started pushing these women systematically out of these platforms and ended us up at this point where there's so much policing. The other thing I wanted to say is that there's different forms of harassment. So I think there's different checks in terms of policing. So for example, on Twitter, it's often very direct. It's direct messages that you get that are sexual in nature or derogatory in nature, or comments to a post that you may have made. On Facebook, we found that the form of harassment was very different. The largest form of harassment over there was morphing of images. Now that's something which you really have no control over. So when you think about this policing aspect, what are you supposed to do to check someone picking up your image and pasting it on another image? So, I think self-policing itself has so many limitations. You can do it only so far, and beyond that, you can't. And the other thing I wanted to, make an observation about, and this perhaps has echoes in global comparisons as well, which is that the degree of harassment seems to increase with the perceived position of power that the woman enjoys, or the perceived position of authority. Amnesty International did a fantastic deep dive report into this, and just the degree of harassment that women politicians face. I'm sure women from the performing arts face it as well, but perhaps in a different way. But just this one niche of women politicians and the degree of harassment that they face and the degree of sexual abuse, content-wise that they face is absolutely crazy. So I think it's almost like a push and shove where the more the woman is perceived to be in a position of power or authority, the more the pushback is on her in terms of just attacking who she is and what she has to say. There's an interesting example of Priyanka Chaturvedi, who's now part of the Shiv Sena, who a couple of years back decided to make the transition from one political party to the other. It was an avalanche, in terms of what she faced, and she kept reiterating the point, saying, "I'm not the first politician to have switched from one party to the other, but it seems to be that because I'm a woman, I'm facing this kind of targeted abuse for the choices that I have made." So, I just wanted to make that point about self-policing and the fact that it does hit limitations. I mean, Aditi and Shruti have, shared some great data around it, but these were our other observations while sort of delving back into history.
Yeah. I'd like to quickly jump in here. And I mean, what Mitali said was completely right. And on a personal note, like as young women, seeing such strong women being faced with such consistent and unique form of bullying and trolling makes us feel like, okay, maybe we shouldn't express ourselves. Maybe we shouldn't be in this position where we have so many followers who can troll us. I mean, should we be in this position? I mean, it really affects our psyche. It really affects a lot of women's ambition to reach out to a larger community, because that community there can be so much backlash from the same community that you're wanting to reach out to. So that leads to affecting labor force participation, because as Shruti said, one of the positives of social media is connectivity, is social commerce. So it really affects various forms of women's participation in various sectors. So yeah, that was just a personal note I wanted to bring in here.
Thanks, Aditi. One point that had come up previously is data and the challenges that come with quantifying the extent of, say, online harassment or cybercrimes against women in the absence of gender disaggregated data. So, for example, with the NCRB, I believe gender-based online harassment is a separate category, but then we don't know, for example, in other categories of cybercrime, what percentage target women, and there's other categories of cybercrime that come under this as well. So what are some of your recommendations in terms of, say, better data that could help shape policy responses? Shruti, if you would like to start, and then
I'll jump in if I may, and then we'll hear from the others. Amber can correct me if I'm wrong, but we actually tried to delve into that, and we did not find any disaggregated data for gender, not from Google, not from IAMAI. I think, again, Amber can correct me, but I don't think it even exists in terms of geographical breakup. So, this kind of disaggregation is really, really important in order to understand what we're talking about when we talk about gender. We don't have that at this point, not that I know of. The more data we get, frankly, the better. Look, data is dialogue. It opens up the capacity to have a healthy argument or a healthy conversation about what exists, what doesn't exist, and what we can do. Equally, I think, Trisha, we picked platforms such as Facebook and Twitter, but I think so much is happening on social messaging platforms. That's a whole other beast, and I think we need, a lot of data, frankly, on what's happening within this WhatsApp universe. What kind of, as you were saying earlier, what kind of targeted harassment can be sort of identified and attacked, because that happens as well. With female politicians or female journalists, there is a targeted attack that they face both on these social messaging platforms or chat platforms, as also on social media itself. So I think we have a really long way to climb in terms of data. Shruti alluded to some of the Facebook insights, that's there. But, I would frankly say we have not done enough at all to even scratch the surface in terms of either who is being represented, for example, this question of metros versus non-metros. So even the point that you're making about what is the workplace doing to support women online, unfortunately, we're such a privileged lot to even have that conversation, to even demand that or expect that. Whereas there is this whole universe of women who either have very limited access online, and when they do, I don't think they can even expect any kind of redressal from their employer with regards to that, So data is king or queen, whichever you want to call it. And I think on that, we really need to do a lot of deep digging. But, we'll hear from everyone else as well on that.
Absolutely. Like Mitali said, policies are a reflection of the amount of data we have. So policies to protect women online can only evolve if we have solid data on which what segment of women are affected the most, how can we, be it urban, be it rural, be it economic class, etc. We need solid data on this, which we just don't have. And when we're talking about social media, online platforms, and the NCRB, as you mentioned, Trisha, as well, a lot of the data of crime reporting includes online reporting of these crimes, which, of course, we, as Mitali said earlier as well, we just don't have enough of. Either because women are not aware of these, or they just don't feel comfortable reporting these incidents to law enforcement. So we need to take a complete step back, make it, for us to get data, we need to make women feel safer in approaching this problem as something that can and will be addressed, so that we can find out exactly who needs to be protected, how they need to be protected. And over simplifying it by just creating laws for protection is not the answer, of course. The answer is a whole systemic overhaul of cultural sensitization of the society, but that is obviously a long ways ahead. So before that can happen, we need these specific instances of protection. So data generation, both in terms of who is affected and how, as well as crime reporting, etc., in order to, by disseminating how these crimes can be reported, both offline and online, and percolating to the areas where, the most remote areas where these things aren't even, people don't even know that these mechanisms for redressal exist. So every step of the chain needs to be looked into in order for us to get this data.
I would like to point out when Mitali was talking about workplace protection, I think, something that we tend to ignore is that most women actually work in the informal sector. So even if they are speaking out on social media, there need to be some kind of redressal mechanisms at their workplaces. So, maybe regulators must think about a way to kind of cover this sector, cover these women who are being excluded from the mainstream. Also, I think even Aditi had mentioned that redressal mechanism they are kind of intimidating at present. I mean, even if a woman wants to go and lodge a complaint, I think the first thought that would come to her or her mind would be, what would I gain from this, and why should I go through all this trouble? What if I will have to reveal a lot of data? And it's so intimidating that women don't want to take this step. So maybe regulators need to make this easier, simpler, maybe anonymous, if that helps women. I think that way data can help, especially through maybe conducting qualitative interviews, not only quantitative data, but also qualitative, like interviewing women and their experiences, trying to gauge, what restricts them, what limits them from actually approaching the redressal mechanisms can maybe help regulators.
Just to quickly jump in here, if I may, Shruti and I, Trisha, you mentioned we did a report on safety concerns affecting women's mobility, and we found solid data to suggest that women are not comfortable to report instances to the authority. Only 2% of women felt comfortable enough to report instances of harassment while traveling to the authority. Most women chose to do nothing. Obviously, there wasn't a follow-up question. This was a very quantitative survey, but clearly women don't feel comfortable to report these incidences. And most women, and this was related to mobility, but most women also didn't know, like about 70% of women didn't know the emergency number to use if such incidents happen. So a lack of trust in law enforcement and authority because of all the things that Shruti mentioned, and a lack of awareness that these mechanisms exist. So only if these two are kind of combined can we also get the data required, because there's self-policing, but there's also lack of self-reporting because of issues like lack of trust. So we need to get to the root of this lack of trust first in order to generate the data we need.
Sorry, I just wanted to add to that point about the I think some of the systemic challenges that we face in terms of both transparency and data, and also responses to them. So I completely agree with Mitali that there is very little disaggregated gender data that we have in terms of the transparency reporting that some of the major platforms do, and that needs to change. That relates to the point that I was making earlier about there is a certain degree of transparency that some of these companies commit themselves to, and that needs to improve drastically. The other issue that was touched upon is that the redressal mechanisms that we have, by particularly the legal redressal mechanisms that we have, whether it is with regard to sexual harassment complaints that women might file at the workplace, which might relate to the online space as well, or it is with regard to redressal mechanisms with respect to some of the criminal provisions that Aditi was talking about, which extend to crimes that are committed online. The issue is that the state apparatus that one has to deal with is often so patriarchal and so difficult to go through that is a very active disincentive to not engage with that process at all. It is actually a very, very difficult and painful process to have to go through and deal with that legal apparatus. And there, I think, again, in a country like India, what is therefore far more important is to have better co-regulatory measures. I think in that sense, perhaps legal regulations might work best in terms of posing some of these obligations on platforms. And platforms have to emerge as the default make redressal mechanisms that women in marginalized communities may seek from. It's I think the onus on, even if you have laws that protect women against harassment, because of the difficulties in actually navigating that process is such a high barrier. I think we have to look at other forms of solution. While reformation of that process has to be a priority, I think in the meantime we have to look at other forms of redressal and other avenues that redressal may be sought from. And I think that is where platforms, one at the level of legal regulation, more must be demanded of platforms. And platforms also have to, I think, take responsibility in terms of looking at women and other marginalized communities as an important and significant stakeholder that they cater to. So I think that, that's the only thing I wanted to add to what we were discussing.
So we're almost at the close of this discussion. So as like a parting question, there's an interesting model coming out of Facebook where, because their existing content moderation policies have been less than ideal, they instituted an oversight board that provides like third-party advice on the decisions, content moderation decisions they take. And it seems like other platforms might jump on that train as well. I believe Goo announced that it would have its own oversight board as well. If you had some recommendations for these new oversight boards, what would they be? Mitali, first to you.
Okay, so some of the recommendations in place for some of these social media platforms are not the best. The social media platforms are not bathed in milk and honey, but I think some of what's coming through in terms of the laws that are being suggested might not achieve what they want to. I'll just, put that down separately. Trisha, I just want to say that even if you get a third party in, a few weeks back, I was speaking with a journalist called Maria Ressa from the Philippines, who has been the face really of speaking out and journalistic freedom and facing a lot of oppression from government. And she made the point that now here's the baseline, right? Hate speech travels faster, has greater virality, and is immediately much more bait. Okay, so here's where we are. Like that's sort of the sum and total of it. So what are you going to do about that? Because we are asking you to bite the hand that feeds you. So I think being really honest about the situation for the big platforms would be a great place to start. When you're discussing any kind of policy recommendations. The other, like you said, is representation, and I think Amber made a great point. I agree about not just representation but intersectionality. Yesterday, I saw someone tweet about asking when we would see our first LGBTQIA minister in the recent expansion of Council of Ministers. And it really made me think, here we are looking at the number of women and critiquing it and saying, oh, look, it's still not enough and they still don't get core ministries. But there are so many pockets that have zero representation. Like they are not even counted. Forget about the fact that they're waiting outside the door for their turn. So what are we doing to really be mindful? I would say mindfulness about how we want to have this conversation is really important. So one is being honest about what the situation is. The second is about being mindful, and the third I think is which has been a running theme for our conversation. Who is the onus on? When we talk about this, and it's not just about gender. Who is the onus on? If I'm from a minority community and I got targeted, it's on me to provide you the content, to provide you the video, to provide you the text message, to put it. It's all on me. It's not on the person who's the perpetrator of the crime. So we have to think carefully about how we shift responsibility and accountability and to whose shoulders. I think that's the three quick points I'd make about when you're thinking about policy.
So, in my opinion, I completely agree with Mitali, of course, and there should be a simultaneous drive in ensuring that women can access the many benefits of social media platforms. I mean, it's a place you can build a community, express yourself, conduct business, and women. I mean, from every person in the entire gender spectrum. Complete intersectionality and access should experience the benefits of these platforms. So, and simultaneously not experience the negative fallouts. And in order to ensure that the negative experiences aren't there, I feel like the arbitrariness should be cut. I mean, cut the arbitrariness, ensure that both for people who feel like they're targeted arbitrarily and for people who aren't targeted enough. There needs to be some sort of tangible, universal syntax, as Mitali also spoken about, in order to ensure this, so that people feel safer on these platforms and actually can gain the benefits from it. And yeah, data will come later when these issues are more focused. So that's my input.
I think
Amber, would you?
Sorry.
Oh, Shruti, go ahead. Sorry.
So yeah, adding on to what Aditi was kind of talking about was maybe streamlining the regulatory mechanism, making it more accessible, making the virtual spaces more conducive, and so that women feel safe enough to express their opinions, and they don't have to be censored in that sense. So I think this is what is the core of the issue.
Amber, the last set of words is yours.
I just wanted to add, I think the question that you had about the oversight board, that is an interesting model where you have a platform which is setting up a kind of parallel body, and in some instances agreeing to be subject to it. And I think that something of that nature will be explored more and more as we move forward, because of the sort of transnational nature of these platforms. Normally you would think of a domestic regulator being the appropriate authority for something like this, but because of the transnational nature and the range of laws and contexts that they need to deal with, I do think this emerging as an interesting model. And then there are, I think, already some sort of learnings that we can take. So I think one of the key mistakes with the Facebook oversight board that I see is about the mandate itself. I think it would lead to a lot more. It would inspire a lot more trust and confidence if the oversight board was also, a participant in co-designing that mandate, as opposed to it being thrust on it by the platform which was setting it up in the first place. I think that is an interesting and important lesson for any other, whether it is school or any other company which is looking to set that up. And I think more and more what we will also see is the something like the Facebook oversight board and what they say as emerging as perhaps persuasive jurisprudence even for courts in different countries, because there is a fair bit of deliberation, very legal form of deliberation that they are engaging in. And that might help guide, I think, the legal discourse and the regulatory discourse around these platforms. But overall, agree with all the kind of concluding points that were made, particularly with regard to the need for more intersectional representation, and I think more and more the need to. I think the platforms have to design for women. It has to be thought from the perspective of how to make some of these processes, both the experience overall as well as the redressal experience, and how those can be made easier and more efficient for women themselves. That's all from me.
Thanks, Ambar, Mitali, Aditi, and Shruti, and thanks to everybody tuning in. If you haven't already, please go read Unsocial Media and engage with the topic online with us as well. Thank you all for joining us.